The cipher clerk's hands were shaking. It was February 23, 1945, just past midnight in London, and he had been decoding secure military traffic for 3 years without incident. He had processed casualty reports, battle plans, intelligence summaries. He had seen words that could end careers and start invasions, but he had never seen anything like the telegram sitting in front of him now, freshly decoded from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters in northwest Germany. The message was addressed to the British Chiefs of Staff, marked with the highest security classification, and buried in the operational assessment was a single paragraph that made the young clerk's stomach drop. Montgomery was calling the Canadian forces under his command fundamentally inadequate for offensive operations. The exact phrase he used was worse. He wrote that the Canadian formations were proving to be more liability than asset, requiring constant British reinforcement to accomplish even basic objectives, and that perhaps it was time to acknowledge they simply lacked the quality necessary for the final push into Germany. The clerk read it twice more, hoping he had made an error in the decryption. He had not. He sealed the message in the red diplomatic pouch and walked it personally to the night duty officer at the War Office. He handed it over without a word, but his expression must have conveyed something, because the duty officer opened it immediately instead of filing it with the morning batch. The officer read through the telegram, his face going pale, then picked up the secure telephone line that connected directly to the Prime Minister's residence. Someone needed to wake Winston Churchill. This could not wait until morning. Churchill had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when his private secretary knocked and entered his bedroom. The Prime Minister sat up immediately, decades of crisis management having trained him to wake fully alert. He listened to the brief explanation, pulled on his dressing gown, and followed the secretary to his study. The telegram was waiting on his desk. Churchill lit a cigar, poured himself a small whiskey despite the hour, and began reading. His jaw tightened. His face flushed. The dangerous crimson that his staff had learned meant volcanic anger was building beneath the surface. When he finished, he set the telegram down with exaggerated care, as if afraid he might tear it apart otherwise. Then he spoke 4 words that his secretary would remember for the rest of his life. "Get me the casualty lists." Within an hour, Churchill's desk was covered with reports. Canadian casualty figures from D-Day forward, operational assessments from various British commanders, intelligence reports on German defensive positions in the Canadian sectors, after-action reports from the Scheldt campaign, from the Rhineland offensive, from a dozen brutal battles that had consumed Canadian lives by the thousands. Churchill read through all of it methodically, his anger shifting from hot to cold, from reactive to calculating. He was building a case in his mind, assembling facts like ammunition. When dawn began to break over London, he called for his secretary again. "I will be drafting a personal response to Montgomery," he said. "It will not go through normal military channels. I want it sent through the diplomatic cipher directly to his headquarters. He is to receive it from me, not from the Chiefs of Staff. Make that very clear." What Churchill could not say aloud, what he barely wanted to acknowledge even to himself, was how personally Montgomery's assessment cut him. Churchill had staked enormous political capital on the Canadian contribution to the war effort. He had stood before Parliament and praised Canadian courage. He had written to Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King expressing Britain's eternal gratitude for Canada's sacrifices. He had positioned the Canadian forces as proof that the Commonwealth stood united, that the bonds between Britain and its former dominions remained strong and vital. And now, here was Britain's most prominent general calling those same forces inadequate, suggesting they were a burden rather than an asset. If this became public, if Canadian newspapers got hold of Montgomery's assessment, the political consequences would be catastrophic. Canada might withdraw from British command entirely. The fragile post-war relationship between Britain and Canada could shatter. And Churchill would bear personal responsibility for having failed to protect Canadian dignity and honor. But Churchill's anger went deeper than political calculation. He knew what the Canadians had accomplished in this war. He had read the reports from Dieppe, where Canadian troops had been fed into a doomed raid that British planners had designed, suffering over 3,000 casualties in a single day while British forces watched from offshore. He knew about Ortona, the brutal house-to-house fighting in Italy, where Canadians had earned the nickname the Devil's Brigade from terrified German defenders. He had followed the Scheldt campaign, where Canadian forces had fought through flooded polders and fortified positions to open the port of Antwerp, suffering over 6,000 casualties in the process. The Scheldt operation had been vital to Allied logistics, and it had been one of the most miserable campaigns of the entire war. British generals had been happy to assign it to the Canadians because it promised high casualties and little glory, and the Canadians had accomplished it despite horrific conditions. Churchill understood something that Montgomery apparently did not. The Canadian forces were not struggling because they lacked courage or competence. They were struggling because they had been consistently assigned the worst possible tasks. When there was a heavily defended position that promised brutal casualties, it went to the Canadians. When there was a thankless, holding action that required absorbing German counterattacks, it went to the Canadians. When there was a logistical nightmare operation through impossible terrain, it went to the Canadians. British commanders had been using Canadian forces as a strategic fire brigade, throwing them at problems too costly for British units to handle, then criticizing them when they took heavy losses and made slow progress. It was exploitation dressed up as operational necessity, and Montgomery's telegram suggested he saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. The dynamic was rooted in an uncomfortable truth about British military thinking. Many British officers still viewed the Dominion forces through an imperial lens. They acknowledged Canadian bravery in the abstract, the same way they might acknowledge the courage of Gurkha troops or African colonial units. But they did not view Canadians as equals or peers. They viewed them as competent colonials who could be called upon in Britain's hour of need, who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve under British command, and who should accept British direction without complaint. This attitude was largely unconscious, a residue of imperial relationships that had supposedly ended but somehow persisted in military hierarchies. Montgomery embodied this attitude more than most. He had commanded Canadian troops since the Normandy invasion, but he had never developed real respect for Canadian commanders or institutions. He tolerated them because political necessity required it, but he did not hide his preference for British units under British leadership. Churchill had no such illusions about empire. He loved the romance of empire, certainly, but he was also a ruthless pragmatist who understood that the world was changing. He knew that Canada was no longer a colony in any meaningful sense. Canada had entered the war by its own declaration, had mobilized its forces independently, and was paying for its war effort from its own treasury. Canada contributed forces to the war not because Britain commanded it, but because Canada chose to stand against fascism. That choice deserved respect and gratitude, not condescension and criticism. If Britain treated its most important Dominion ally with contempt, what hope was there for maintaining Commonwealth cooperation after the war? Churchill understood that his response to Montgomery's telegram was not just about defending Canadian honor, it was about defining what kind of power Britain would be in the post-war world. Would it be a nation that valued its partnerships and treated allies with dignity? Or would it be a fading empire clinging to hierarchies that no longer reflected reality? Churchill began drafting his response as the sun rose over London. He wrote in longhand, crossing out phrases, rewriting sentences, searching for the exact tone he needed. The message had to accomplish multiple things simultaneously. It had to rebuke Montgomery firmly enough that he understood. His assessment was unacceptable. It had to defend Canadian contributions with specific evidence that Montgomery could not dismiss. It had to establish clear expectations about how British commanders would discuss and treat Canadian forces going forward. And it had to do all of this without creating a public scandal or undermining Montgomery's authority at a crucial moment in the war. The balance was delicate, and Churchill rewrote his opening paragraph 4 times before he was satisfied. "Field Marshal Montgomery," Churchill began, "I have received your operational assessment regarding Canadian forces under your command. I must state in the clearest possible terms that your characterization is both factually wrong and politically catastrophic. You describe the Canadian formations as inadequate for offensive operations. The record suggests otherwise. Since D-Day, the 1st Canadian Army has fought continuously in some of the most difficult sectors of the entire campaign. They cleared the Channel ports while British forces advanced on less defended axes. They fought through the Scheldt under conditions that would have broken lesser formations. They have sustained casualties at a rate higher than any comparable British force, yet they remain combat effective and continue to advance." Churchill paused in his writing, considering how direct he needed to be about the real issue. He decided that subtlety would be wasted on Montgomery. "Your assessment ignores a fundamental reality," he continued writing. "Canadian forces have been consistently assigned the most difficult and costly operations precisely because they can be relied upon to accomplish them despite heavy losses. If they are now exhausted, if they are now moving more slowly than you would prefer, perhaps you should consider whether the problem lies with your operational demands rather than their execution. You cannot burn through a force relentlessly and then express surprise when they show signs of fatigue." The Prime Minister stood and walked to the window, looking out over London in the early morning light. The city bore the scars of 5 years of war. Bombed buildings still gaped open to the sky. Parks had been converted to vegetable gardens. The people looked worn and tired. Britain itself was exhausted, having spent blood and treasure on a scale that had nearly broken the nation. And here was Montgomery, commanding forces that included substantial Canadian contributions, having the arrogance to call those forces inadequate. Churchill felt a surge of renewed anger and returned to his desk to continue writing. "Let me remind you of several facts that appear to have escaped your attention," Churchill wrote, his pen moving faster now. "Canada entered this war in 1939 by its own sovereign choice, at a time when its military forces numbered barely 20,000. They have since mobilized over 1 million men and women from a population of 11 million, 1 in every 11. Canadians is in uniform. The equivalent ratio for Britain would be over 4 million people in service, well beyond what we have actually mobilized. Canada's industrial production has provided ships, aircraft, and munitions essential to our war effort. Canadian wheat has helped keep Britain fed. Canadian resources have fueled our factories, and Canadian soldiers have died in every theater of this war, from Hong Kong to the present offensive in Germany." Churchill knew he was writing at length, knew that Montgomery would likely find this lecture condescending, but he did not care. The field marshal needed to understand the larger context of what he was criticizing. "Your telegram," Churchill continued, "suggests that Canadian forces should perhaps be withdrawn from offensive operations and relegated to holding actions. I must inform you that such a decision is absolutely unacceptable and will not be implemented. First, it is militarily unsound. The Canadians are experienced, combat-effective forces who have proven their ability repeatedly. Removing them from the line would weaken your offensive capability, not strengthen it. Second, it is politically impossible. If you attempt to sideline Canadian forces, Prime Minister Mackenzie King will face immediate pressure to withdraw them from British command entirely. The Canadian public and press are already sensitive about how their forces are employed. Any suggestion that we view them as second-rate would create a political firestorm that could fracture the Commonwealth alliance." The Prime Minister paused again, considering how forcefully to make his next point. He decided that Montgomery needed to hear this bluntly. "Let me be absolutely clear about my expectations going forward," Churchill wrote. "You will not again characterize Canadian forces as inadequate or suggest they are less capable than British formations. You will ensure Canadian commanders are consulted meaningfully in operational planning rather than simply receiving orders. You will distribute difficult assignments equitably across all forces under your command rather than concentrating them on Canadian units. And you will remember that these are sovereign forces contributed by an independent ally, not colonial troops subject to imperial direction. They deserve your respect and your gratitude, not your criticism." Churchill could feel himself building toward a conclusion, but he wanted to add one more element to make his position unmistakable. "I have been reviewing casualty reports throughout the night," he wrote. "Since D-Day, the 1st Canadian Army has suffered over 43,000 casualties. Their casualty rate per 1,000 troops engaged is higher than comparable British formations. This is not because they fight badly, it is because they have been given the hardest tasks. The Scheldt operation alone cost them 6,000 casualties. Clearing the Rhineland has cost thousands more. These men are dying to execute your operational plans, and you repay their sacrifice by calling them inadequate. I find this morally repugnant and militarily inexcusable." The Prime Minister set down his pen and read through what he had written. The message was harsh, more direct than he typically was with senior commanders. But Montgomery needed to understand that this was not negotiable, that his attitude toward Canadian forces threatened interests far larger than his operational preferences. Churchill added one final paragraph to make the stakes absolutely clear. "If I receive another such assessment," Churchill wrote, "I will not respond with words. I will recommend to the Chiefs of Staff that Canadian forces be transferred to a different command structure, one where their contributions will be properly valued. This would be professionally humiliating for you and operationally disruptive for the campaign, but I will not allow Canadian forces to remain under a commander who views them with contempt. I trust you. Understand my position and will adjust your conduct accordingly. The Prime Minister." Churchill signed the message and sealed it himself. He called for his secretary and gave specific instructions. "This goes directly to Montgomery through the diplomatic cipher," he said. "I want confirmation when he receives it, and I want you to prepare a separate communication to Prime Minister Mackenzie King. Tell him that I have reviewed recent operations by Canadian forces and wish to express Britain's profound gratitude for their courage and effectiveness. Be specific about the Rhineland offensive. Use warm language. I want him to receive that message before any whisper of Montgomery's assessment could possibly reach Ottawa." The secretary nodded and left with the documents. Churchill sat alone in his study as full daylight filled the room. He felt drained, the anger that had sustained him through the night now replaced by a deep weariness. This was the exhausting reality of coalition warfare. It was not enough to defeat the enemy. You also had to constantly manage the egos and prejudices of your own side, preventing them from destroying the alliance from within. Montgomery's telegram was not just an operational assessment, it was a symptom of deeper problems in how Britain related to its allies and partners. If those problems were not confronted, they would poison relationships that needed to remain strong in the post-war world. Montgomery received Churchill's message 36 hours later at his headquarters in Strehlen, Germany. He was in the middle of a planning conference when his signals officer brought in the red folder marked for immediate personal attention. Montgomery excused himself and read the message in private. His staff, waiting outside, heard nothing from his office for over 20 minutes. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, and his characteristic confidence was notably absent. He dismissed the planning conference without explanation and spent the rest of the day closeted with his chief of staff, a pragmatic officer named Francis de Guingand, who had long served as Montgomery's connection to political reality. De Guingand read Churchill's message and immediately understood the severity of the situation. "Sir," he said carefully, "the Prime Minister is not exaggerating the political consequences. If this becomes public, if the Canadians feel they have been insulted, we will lose their cooperation. And losing Canadian forces at this stage of the campaign would be disastrous." Montgomery sat in silence for a long moment. He was not accustomed to being rebuked so directly, especially not by civilian authority. His instinct was to defend his assessment, to argue that he had simply been providing an honest evaluation of force capabilities. But even Montgomery could recognize when he had miscalculated badly. "You think I should back down," he said finally. It was not really a question. De Guingand chose his words carefully. "Sir, I think you should recognize that military assessments exist within a political context. Whatever the tactical reality, calling Canadian forces inadequate serves no useful purpose and creates enormous problems. The Prime Minister is giving you an opportunity to correct course before this escalates. I strongly advise taking that opportunity." Montgomery nodded slowly, his pride visibly warring with his pragmatism. "Draft a response," he said. "Make it clear that I value Canadian contributions and that my previous assessment was incomplete. Be fulsome in your praise. I will review it before it goes out." The response that eventually went to Churchill 3 days later was everything Montgomery's original telegram had not been. It praised Canadian courage and persistence. It acknowledged the difficult missions they had been assigned. It recognized the heavy casualties they had sustained. It promised greater consultation with Canadian commanders and more equitable distribution of operational burdens. The contrast with his earlier message was so stark that anyone comparing the two would have immediately recognized Montgomery had been compelled to reverse his position. But both messages remained classified, seen only by a handful of people with the highest security clearances. To the outside world, nothing appeared to have changed. But within the British and Canadian command structures, everything had changed. Word of Churchill's intervention spread quietly through senior officers. British commanders who shared Montgomery's condescension toward Dominion forces understood they needed to be more circumspect. Canadian commanders, who had often felt their concerns were dismissed or ignored, found their British counterparts suddenly more solicitous and respectful. The shift was not dramatic or universal, but it was real. Churchill had drawn a line, and that line had consequences. For Churchill personally, the incident reinforced a lesson he had learned repeatedly throughout the war: managing alliances required constant vigilance. The Americans had their own sensitivities and their own complaints about British leadership. The Soviets were perpetually suspicious of Western intentions. The French were prickly about their status and authority. And now the Canadians, who should have been the easiest partners given the historical ties, needed defending against British arrogance. It was exhausting work, and it never ended. But it was absolutely essential. Wars were won by coalitions, and coalitions held together only through careful management of relationships and egos. The larger truth that emerged from this incident was about respect and partnership. Montgomery had failed to recognize that the nature of Britain's relationship with Canada had fundamentally changed. Canada was no longer a Dominion content to follow British leadership unquestioningly. It was an independent nation making its own choices about how to contribute to the war effort. Treating Canadian forces as inferior or inadequate was not just tactically wrong, it was politically blind. It ignored the reality that Canada's continued cooperation depended on feeling valued and respected. Churchill understood this intuitively, having spent his career navigating the politics of empire and alliance. Montgomery, for all his tactical brilliance, had been tone-deaf to these realities. The incident also revealed deeper patterns in how difficult operations were assigned during the campaign. The concentration of costly missions on Canadian forces was not coincidental or accidental. It reflected a systematic tendency to protect British casualties while accepting Canadian losses. This pattern had military logic behind it. British manpower reserves were nearly exhausted by early 1945. Every British casualty was difficult to replace. Canadian forces, while also depleted, had slightly deeper reserves to draw upon. So British commanders naturally tried to husband British lives while spending Canadian lives more freely. But this calculation, however rational from a narrow British perspective, was corrosive to the alliance. It created the impression that Canadian soldiers were viewed as expendable, that their lives mattered less than British lives. Churchill recognized this pattern and understood it needed to change, not just for moral reasons, but for practical political ones. In the months following Churchill's intervention, operational assignments became somewhat more equitably distributed. British forces took on a larger share of difficult objectives. Canadian commanders were consulted more meaningfully in planning processes. The changes were not transformative, but they were noticeable enough that Canadian officers remarked on them in their reports. The field marshal, one Canadian brigadier noted in a letter home, has become considerably less imperious since February. He actually asks our opinion now instead of simply issuing orders. The brigadier did not know about Churchill's message to Montgomery, but he could see its effects. The broader Canadian public never learned about Montgomery's telegram or Churchill's response. The incident remained classified for decades, filed away in the archives as one of thousands of wartime communications deemed too sensitive for public release. Canadian newspapers continued to cover the exploits of Canadian forces in Germany, reporting on battles won and ground captured. Prime Minister Mackenzie King received Churchill's warm message of gratitude and appreciation, which he shared with Parliament and the press. The narrative that reached Canadians was one of valued partnership and mutual respect, with no hint of the underlying tensions that Churchill had moved so decisively to suppress. But among those who did know the full story, the incident became a case study in effective leadership and alliance management. Churchill had recognized a threat to coalition cohesion and acted immediately to neutralize it. He had defended a partner who could not defend himself. He had drawn clear boundaries about acceptable conduct and made those boundaries enforceable through threat of consequences. And he had done all of this quietly, without public drama or spectacle, solving the problem rather than exploiting it for political gain. This was statecraft at its most effective, dealing with a crisis before it could metastasize into something larger and more destructive. The war in Europe ended less than 3 months after this incident. Canadian forces participated in the final offensives into Germany, fighting through determined resistance as the Nazi regime collapsed. They were present at the liberation of the Netherlands, where Dutch civilians greeted them as heroes and where relationships were forged that would endure for generations. The 1st Canadian Army had suffered over 44,000 casualties by war's end, a staggering toll from a nation of barely 11 million people. They had fought with distinction from the beaches of Normandy to the plains of northern Germany, accomplishing every mission assigned despite the heavy costs. In the immediate aftermath of victory, Churchill made a point of publicly recognizing Canadian contributions. In speeches and statements, he praised Canadian courage and sacrifice. He ensured that Canadian forces were prominently featured in victory celebrations and that Canadian commanders received appropriate honors and recognition. Some of this was genuine gratitude, but some was also political calculation, continuing to repair and strengthen relationships that he knew would matter in the post-war world. Churchill understood that the alliance forged in war would need to persist into peace, and that persistence required constant attention to the dignity and sensitivities of all partners. Montgomery went on to accept the German surrender in Northern Europe and to serve as chief of the Imperial General Staff after the war. He never publicly acknowledged his assessment of Canadian forces or Churchill's rebuke. In his memoirs written years later, he praised Canadian contributions in general terms without mentioning any of the tensions that had existed. This selective memory was characteristic of Montgomery, who throughout his life found it difficult to acknowledge errors or to give full credit to forces he had not personally commanded. The telegram criticizing Canadian forces remained buried in classified files, unknown to the historians who wrote the first accounts of the war. Churchill's role in defending Canadian forces also remained largely unknown for decades. The Prime Minister's own war memoirs, massive and detailed though they were, made no mention of the incident. Whether this was discretion, a desire not to embarrass Montgomery posthumously, or simply the recognition that there were some diplomatic successes best left unmentioned, the result was the same. The story remained hidden, known only to the handful of people who had direct access to the classified communications. It was not until the 1970s and 80s, as wartime documents began to be declassified, and as historians gained access to previously restricted archives, that the full story began to emerge. Researchers working through Churchill's papers found his draft response to Montgomery. Canadian military historians found references to the incident in command diaries and personal letters. British archives yielded Montgomery's original telegram and his subsequent retraction. Slowly, the pieces came together, revealing an incident that encapsulated many of the tensions and challenges of coalition warfare. The revelation of this story created different reactions in different countries. In Canada, it validated what many veterans had long believed, that they had not always received the recognition or respect they deserved from British command. The fact that Churchill had defended them resonated deeply, confirming that at least someone in British leadership had understood and valued Canadian sacrifices. Canadian historians held up the incident as evidence of both the challenges Canadians faced in asserting their place within the alliance and the importance of political leadership in protecting national interests and dignity. In Britain, the reaction was more complex. Some saw it as an embarrassing revelation of imperial attitudes that should have been left in the past. Others argued that Montgomery's assessment had been taken out of context, that he had been providing an honest military evaluation that Churchill had misinterpreted as political insult. Still, others saw it as an example of the impossible position British commanders had been in, trying to win a war with limited resources while managing the sensitivities of multiple allies. The debate revealed ongoing tensions about how Britain remembered the war and its role as an imperial power, transitioning to a different kind of global presence. For students of leadership and international relations, the incident became a teaching case about alliance management and the importance of respect in coalition warfare. Churchill's intervention demonstrated several important principles. First, that military operations cannot be separated from political context, that assessments of force capabilities exist within larger frameworks of national sensitivity and partnership dynamics. Second, that leaders must sometimes defend partners against their own side, that coalition leadership requires protecting allies from internal criticism as much as from external threats. Third, that clear boundaries and consequences are essential to changing behavior, that Montgomery modified his conduct not because of moral persuasion, but because he understood the threat to his position was real. The incident also highlighted the particular challenges of leading coalitions where partners have vastly different levels of power and resources. Britain and Canada were not equals in any material sense. Britain was a great power, Canada a middle power. Britain provided the bulk of forces and resources, Canada a significant but smaller contribution. In such asymmetric partnerships, the temptation for the stronger party to dismiss or belittle the weaker party is constant. Effective coalition leadership requires resisting that temptation, recognizing that the commitment and sacrifice of smaller partners matter enormously, even if their material contributions are proportionally less. Churchill understood this. Montgomery, at least initially, did not. Looking back from the perspective of decades later, the incident takes on additional significance as an example of the challenges Britain faced in transitioning from empire to a different kind of international role. The condescension Montgomery showed toward Canadian forces was rooted in imperial attitudes that assumed British superiority and dominion deference. Those attitudes were already obsolete by 1945, but they persisted in the minds of men who had been shaped by the imperial system. Churchill, for all his romantic attachment to empire, recognized that the world was changing and that Britain needed to adapt. His defense of Canadian forces was part of that adaptation, an acknowledgement that partnerships of the future would need to be based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy and command. The story of Churchill's response to Montgomery's telegram deserves to be remembered not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because it reveals the human dimensions of coalition leadership. Wars are not won solely through brilliant strategy or overwhelming force. They are won through the patient, unglamorous work of keeping diverse partners working together toward common goals. That work requires constant attention to relationships, sensitivity to partners' dignity and concerns, and willingness to confront problems before they metastasize. Churchill demonstrated all of these qualities in his response to Montgomery. He saw a threat to the alliance, understood its implications, and acted decisively to neutralize it. He defended forces who could not defend themselves and drew clear boundaries about acceptable conduct. And he did it all quietly, without public drama, solving the problem rather than exploiting it. The Canadian soldiers who fought through northwestern Europe in 1945 never knew that the Prime Minister of Great Britain had defended their reputation in a classified telegram to their commanding general. They knew only that they had been given difficult missions, that they had accomplished those missions despite heavy costs, and that they had helped win the war against Nazi Germany. Their courage and sacrifice spoke for itself, requiring no defense or justification. But knowing that Churchill recognized their contributions, that he valued their partnership enough to confront his own general about it, adds a dimension to their story that matters. It shows that their service was not taken for granted, that their dignity was defended at the highest levels, and that the alliance they fought to preserve was worth the effort not just strategically, but morally. That is why this story, buried for decades in classified archives, deserves to be told and remembered. It reminds us that leadership sometimes means defending those who cannot defend themselves, that respect must be fought for even among allies, and that the most important battles are sometimes the ones fought with words rather than weapons.